Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 65 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is legendary author Ursula K Le Guin, who is the first writer to ever have 2 books win both the Hugo and Nebula Awards. Her novels include The Left Hand of Darkness, about an alien world on which gender is both temporary and fluid, A Wizard of Earthsea, about a brash young wizard who unwittingly unleashes a great evil, and The Lathe of Heaven, about a scientist who attempts to remake the world using a man whose dreams become reality.
Then stick around after the interview as we discuss the life and works of Ray Bradbury with guest geek Rajan Khanna.
Alright, so let's get to our interview. Alright, so we're here with Ursula K Le Guin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, it's been reported that some of the protesters at Occupy Oakland have been carrying shields in the image of books, including your novel, The Dispossessed. Just how do you feel about that?
Terrific. I am proud and happy that a book, and actually a book printed quite a long time ago now, is still making some waves and being of some use to people thinking about this stuff.
Did you write any of those books sort of intending to inspire action, or was it just purely artistic?
I do try to separate my personal activism, showing up at a demonstration or something, from what I write. I don't write tracts, I write novels. I'm not a preacher. I'm a fiction writer, you know. I get a lot of moral guidance from reading novels, so I guess I expect my novels to offer some moral guidance, but they're not blueprints for action, ever.
So in 2008, you wrote an article in Harper's called Staying Awake, Notes on the Alleged Decline of Reading, in which you lamented corporate control of publishing. Have things changed at all for better or worse since you wrote that article?
I think they've gone downhill. I mean, I think corporate control has just increased, and as publishing goes into sort of terminal panic about how to handle e-publishing, maybe this is the dark part of the tunnel, and we're going to figure out how to do it and how to pay writers some kind of decent return for their writing. But at the moment, I don't teach anymore. I don't teach writing classes anymore, and I'm really glad I don't, because I would feel very strange about telling people, oh, go out there and be a writer and make a living from it. I mean, the writers and the editors are very, very low on the totem pole in the world of corporate publishing. And I don't think it's very good for books. And I know it isn't very good for what writers have to, how they buy their peanut butter.
So a few years ago, you resigned from the Authors Guild over their settlement with Google. Could you talk a bit about that?
That was over the Google settlement, which appeared to be, in many ways, wrong-headed and unjust settlement with Google, who was doing a tremendous, and is continuing to do, a tremendous rip-off job of printing copyrighted material without asking or obtaining permission. And the Authors Guild seemed to be sort of settling and saying, oh, well, all right, you know, you're so big and we're so little, I don't know. So I was indignant, and I withdrew, and it made a much bigger stink than I expected it to. The Authors Guild had never really noticed me for about 35 years, but they noticed when I dropped out, and a lot of other people did, and so I found myself sort of helping along a sort of anti-Google protest movement by writers and readers, but mostly by professional writers, people who make their living from writing. And I was pretty well out of my depth in many ways, because it's a terrifically complicated issue. But there were many very smart people and lawyers and stuff helping. And so we did get a protest moving going that we were able to write Judge Chin, who was arbitrating the case, and I think make some points which persuaded him to to judge as he did. So I found myself an activist where I never expected to be one.
So you've expressed disappointment with some of the film and TV adaptations of your work. When it comes to adaptations, do you have any advice that you pass along to other writers?
Don't believe what the people in Hollywood say. Do not believe these people. These people do not speak fully. And they tell you that they admire your work so much, and you're going to have all the input over it. And so, forget it. You don't have artistic control. Nobody but Rowling ever got artistic control over a film made up from their stuff. And, she got it because she's so wealthy. You're not going to get it. Therefore, you have to think, do you mind if they make a travesty out of your work? Is the money worth it to you? If it is, go for it. Take the money and run, as whoever it was said. If it's not worth it to you, just run away.
So in retrospect, would you say it wasn't worth it to you, or and you wish you hadn't allowed maybe the sci-fi Earthsea adaptation, or?
Oh yeah, I very much wish that I'd trusted my instincts and don't trust these guys. They have no respect for the work or for you, and they're just going to make a mess out of it, which they did. Turn everybody white, dip them in the bleach, and so on. The one movie that I'm really glad I made and that I'm still kind of proud of is the old 1980 film of The Lathe of Heaven, in which I did play as much part as I wanted to. I couldn't actually very much at the time, but that's a good movie still. It still holds up. There was a pointless, meaningless remake of it that just died almost instantly. One of the weirdest things about movie people is that they always want to remake. It must be easier or something. But they keep going. The requests over and over and over. They talk about Earthsea and they talk about The Lathe of Heaven as if I hadn't written anything else. Maybe they don't read. Maybe they just look at other people's movies and think, oh, I could do that.
Are there any other recent or upcoming adaptations of your work, of your other works?
Oh, we've got a lot of requests on hand. Some of them do look rather promising and serious, but I can't talk about them.
I saw was there a recent theatrical production of The Lathe of Heaven?
Yeah, in New York. Edward Einhorn did it. I think it was a venue in the Village, I think. I've seen a little kind of handheld video of it, and it looks really interesting. He did it with just 4 actors, and really no set, but using projection slides, which is a lovely way to do fantasy on stage. And there was an opera this spring on my Paradise is Lost, which is a novella, and it was made into a very beautiful opera, which they produced at the University of Illinois, which I hope gets picked up by other opera companies because it is really kind of cool. I think I do better on stage maybe than on film on average so far.
There's been a large amount of academic criticism devoted to your work. Do you ever read any of that? And is there any that you think is particularly noteworthy, either for being good or for being bad?
Well, I read some of it. A lot of it's kind of written for other academics, Yeah, there are certain writers like Brian Atterbury or Jim Bittner who I think really kind of understand my work and sometimes can explain it to me. Oh, is that what I was doing? Never thought of that,
So your book reviews that you write in The Guardian sometimes chide authors for saying that their work isn't science fiction when it clearly is. For example, you wrote this review of Jeanette Winterson's The Stone Gods, and you said, "I'm bothered by the curious ingratitude of authors who exploit a common fund of imagery while pretending to have nothing to do with the fellow authors who created it and left it open for all who want to use it." Do you ever get responses to comments like that from the authors or their supporters or fans or anything like that?
Well, I not that I know of. To tell you the truth, I've never checked it out. I am old enough that I grew up before there was an internet, and I just am not in the habit of using the internet to what people think of me.
But, speaking of authors who say that they don't write science fiction, Margaret Atwood has kind of become this lightning rod among some fans.
I've been needling Maggie for years now. Come on, Maggie. You do. You know you write science fiction. She's in a difficult position, obviously, with her publisher. She herself has sort of redefined science fiction to be what Margaret Atwood doesn't write, which is okay. And because Margaret Atwood, to some extent, really can do no wrong in my book, that's okay. But I do sort of keep arguing with her because it doesn't really hold water, her definition. Science fiction is not about the impossible, the non-existent. That's fantasy. And she sort of says that she only writes about what is possible and so on. Well, a lot of science fiction does exactly that. I think the whole argument is just withering away because people don't care that much anymore. A lot of people, whether you call it sci-fi or science fiction or mainstream or realism or whatever, it's all getting kind of mixed up together. It's all literature. And that's the way it ought to be, I think.
So are you optimistic that someday you might get her to concede that just, okay, Oryx and Crake, it was a little bit science fiction? You got me there.
I wouldn't predict anything about Margaret Atwood. No.
Okay, so we had a couple questions from listeners. One of them says, growing up, my favorite book was The Tombs of Achuan, and it always struck me as being beautifully strange for not having the series protagonist show up until 3/4 of the way through. And he'd like you to just talk about why you made that choice, and it seems like maybe publishers would be wary of something like that.
Well, that's kind of funny. It isn't 3/4 of the way through. It's, I would say, maybe 1/3 of the way into the book. Ged shows up. That book was written before series were invented in fantasy. Tolkien had written what was called a trilogy, although he didn't call it a trilogy. I think trilogies were just beginning perhaps to be fashionable, but fantasies weren't, they didn't fall into these categories they do now. Ged was not a series hero. He was the hero of a novel called A Wizard of Earthsea. This was a sequel. That's all there was to it. In other words, fantasy was not controlled by the advertising department and what's going to sell. Fantasy was controlled by the author to a larger extent than it is now. And the book has two protagonists, a young woman and a slightly older man. And it's sort of their interaction that makes the book happen. But that's not an unfamiliar situation in novels. It's just that I think this listener is just used to sort of conventional mass-produced fantasy, where you have a series hero and certain things are done in certain ways and so on.
Did you ever experience any pressure from publishers to make your work more conventional in any way?
Within the last few years only. My 3 fantasy novels, Gifts, Voices, and Powers, I had, as always, good editors to work with at Harcourt where they were published, but there was an increasing pressure to make them more like Harry Potter. There's just no getting around it. And since I write a very, very different type of fantasy and different type of literature from the Harry Potter series, this was just, no way could I go along with it. I just had to resist it. But that you see, that's very late, and it kind of happened as publishing was beginning to kind of lose its sense of direction and sense of purpose, and getting very confused by corporate pressures on all sides.
So I'm a big fan of Philip K. Dick, and when I attended the Clarion Writers Workshop, Tim Powers and Karen Joy Fowler assigned each of us a book to read that they thought would resonate with us, and the book that they assigned me was The Lathe of Heaven, which they, and I've heard others have described it as being an homage to Philip K. Dick, and I've just always wondered if that's true. And
yeah, definitely. You know, I couldn't write a Phil Dick book, but I could steal some of his tricks in a way, and that kind of pulling reality out from under the reader all the time, you know, changing reality on him the way he does. Well, I did it through George's dreams. Phil would have done it another way, but yeah, homage to Phil Dick is right.
did you know him at all? Did you interact with him?
We talked on the telephone, and we corresponded some, but we never actually met, except we must have met in high school because we were at Berkeley High School at the same time. But nobody I know remembers him. He is the unknown man from my class at Berkeley High.
Well, that's sort of funny because in a lot of his stories, one that comes to mind is Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said. It's about a guy who suddenly nobody knows who he is anymore. I wonder if that was autobiographical in any way.
Oh, must be. I don't know. I'm rather proud of the fact that I was kind of defending Phil Dick's work early on when he was not being paid much attention to and never kept in print. And I kept saying, this guy is really good. This guy is writing completely original stuff. It's why nobody, you know, it isn't conventional. It isn't run-of-the-mill. It's different, but it's really interesting. And, of course, Phil picked up on that. And, you know, you always like, when another writer likes your stuff, you kind of want to know that writer. So we just, I don't know, he may have written me or him. Yeah, we talked some. And I got a little bit bossy and told him that the women in his novels were kind of predictable. And I didn't really think he'd pay any attention. But he did. Apparently he really started trying to think about the way he'd been handling women in his fiction, which that touches me. That, you know, he didn't have to pay any mind to anything I said.
Do you remember what year that was that people would look for that sort of change in his fiction?
I think the novel where he tried to sort of write women different, I think it was Valis, V-A-L-I-S. So it's kind of late. We're getting into the novels after he had that sort of revelation thing he had and began writing a rather different kind of book.
So years ago, I read your 2 books on writing, Steering the Craft and The Language of the Night. And one thing that really struck me from those were your comments about how wrong-headed many of our so-called rules of grammar are. I was just wondering, are there any particular grammar rules that you would just want to see just go away?
I was probably talking about the fact that the grammarians kept telling us that we can't use they as a singular, like if anybody needs an abortion, he should have to tell his mother and father. We can only use he as because he is the generic pronoun. Well, I mean, this is nonsense in English. And English has always used they. It's in Shakespeare. You know, anybody needs an abortion, they should not have to tell their parents. And it's one of these arbitrary bans that every now and then grammarians get away with. And that kind of thing where there's a moral influence from it. You have to talk about that. The easiest thing to do with grammar is just accept the rules and use them as you see fit. But you have to know them before you can break them. That's the only rule I accept.
So there's a recent book called 80, Memories and Reflections on Ursula K Le Guin. How did that come about?
Oh, it's what they call a fest trip. They get people together to sort of celebrate somebody who's having a birthday or something. And I've had my 80th birthday. And so it's just a lot of very nice people sort of put a little book together with, there's some stories about me and just stories and stuff. It was a nice present for a birthday.
So there's also a documentary in the works called Worlds of Ursula K Le Guin. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
It's Arlen Curry is making it, and she and I have been working together on and off for a couple of years now. Well, I can't tell you about the documentary itself because I haven't seen it. I don't really know where it's at. It's just that Arlen and I she's been coming here and filming on and off for the last couple of years. And we talked together, and we've gone places that are important in my life so she could film me there, like the ranch in the Napa Valley where I spent all my summers as a kid and still go every summer. Or next month, she's going to meet me out in Southeast Oregon at a farmhouse where we spend a week every year under Steens Mountain, which is the country that I've come to love very much. And so, she's going to put all this together, and I don't know what it's going to be like, but I trust Arlen Curry to do it well.
So we mentioned that for the second half of our show today, we'll be talking about Ray Bradbury. Do you have any memories relating to Bradbury that you'd like to share?
I only met Ray 2 or 3 times, always down in L.A., because he was not a traveler, as you know. And he was always very genial and a little bit overbearing. A great big football player of a guy. He was very nice. You had the sense of this warmth of the personality that come through in his books too. I don't know anybody that has anything against Ray Bradbury. Maybe there are people, but he seems not to have made enemies, which is that's pretty good going for a writer that successful and living in Los Angeles.
Is there anything maybe about any of his books that you remember or that are favorites of yours or anything like that?
Oh, the Martian Chronicles. I read that fairly. It came out a long time ago. I was in my 20s at most, I guess, and I just loved it. He was making science fiction romantic. Science fiction often gets kind of hard-edged and dry and a little over-intellectual, And I thought, oh, wow, look what he's doing. He's making it beautiful and romantic with this kind of warmth of human feeling in it. And that was important then.
Okay, and so finally, are there any other new or upcoming projects that you'd like to mention?
2 things this fall is that all 6 books of Earthsea will finally be published in the uniform edition in the United States, which is a real joy to me. Houghton Mifflin Harcourt is putting out the hardcover, and Simon & Schuster does the paperback. And so that'll all be out. I think I don't have a pub date yet, but I guess it's September probably. And also, I have a new and selected poems, which means that it's a kind of retrospective of my selected from my 6 poetry books and a whole set of new poems, and that's coming out from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt this fall too. And I'm very pleased about that. It's called Finding My Elegy. I got a story coming out in Tin House, I guess maybe next issue. It's called Elementals. Kind of fantasy. All along the Borges line, I guess, a little.
Okay, great. So Ursula K Le Guin, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Thank you very much.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Ursula K Le Guin for joining us on the show. And as we mentioned, for our panel today, we'll be discussing the life and works of Ray Bradbury, who died on June 5th at the age of 91. And we have a special guest geek joining us for that, Rajan Khanna. His fiction has appeared in Beneath Ceaseless Skies and The Way of the Wizard, as well as on the Podcastle podcast. His article, Ray Bradbury, Mr. Electro and Me, recently appeared on litreactor.com. So Raj, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and so I think we're just going to start out and talk a little bit about how we first encountered Ray Bradbury's work. And maybe Raj, since you're new, you can go first and just tell us, how did you first encounter Ray Bradbury?
When I was a kid, I was really into audiobooks. It was something that my grandmother had started with me. And I remember seeing audiobooks for the first time in Walden Books or something like that. And right next to the checkout counter, there was The Illustrated Man and Other Stories, read actually by Ray Bradbury. And it looked cool because it had a picture of a tattooed man on the cover. So I asked my mother to buy it for me, and she did. And I remember going home and listening to it. And so that was really my first encounter with Ray Bradbury, which was through an audiobook. And it wasn't the exact lineup of the Illustrated Man collection. It was a bunch of different stories. And I was kind of young for it, I think, because, you know, a lot of them were a little spooky for me at the time. But I knew I was interested in stories. But the moment that I had where I realized what good writing was and like what language could do was listening to The Illustrated Man on that audio tape, because I remember the specific passage. It was later. It was maybe a few years after I had first got it and listened to it. It was, I guess I was a little older, and I remember there was a sequence where he describes the Illustrated Man, who's this really fat guy, right, William Philippus Phelps, and he talks about his brontosaur bones and the vast oceans of pop or orange juice that he's been drinking. And I just remember having this epiphany of like, wow, you know, like that's amazing that you can take these ideas and kind of merge them together. And so that was like my first awakening as a writer, that language could do more than just tell you exactly what was happening. It could, you know, verge into symbol and metaphor. And so that always stuck with me through the years.
Yeah, for me, I think it was just Fahrenheit 451 was my introduction to Bradbury. I had to read it in school, probably freshman year of high school. And as I was sort of want to do when I was assigned books in school, I just couldn't read them. I only, I just refused to read anything that I was assigned. And I would just, you know, answer the study questions as best I could by skimming through the book. And that's how I, you know, passed my tests and whatnot. And so, you know, Fahrenheit 451 was one of many books that I sort of resented when I was a teenager because I was assigned it. And it wasn't until later, a couple of years later, probably when I was 18 or so, I was working at a Walden Books, and the summer reading lists were coming out, and a bunch of kids had Fahrenheit 451 on there, and so we were selling a lot of copies, and I was just like, this sounds like such an awesome book. I don't know why I didn't get into it. And so, so I picked it up and I read it and just fell in love with it. And I mean, it's just such an amazing book. I mean, it became one of my favorite books and has remained so to this day. And, was even, a primary inspiration for me doing my anthology, Brave New Worlds, which is a dystopian anthology. And, as much as it's named after, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, but to me, Fahrenheit 451 is sort of a greater influence on me as far as dystopian fiction goes. And it's funny because I really remember vividly the day that I was reading the book, I sat and I read it all at once, like from cover to cover, just like basically one reading session. But it was funny because I was living in Florida and our air conditioner had broken, so it was like really, really hot in the house, and I was sitting at home, I was waiting for the air conditioner repairman to come, and so I thought it was kind of funny that I spent my day reading a book that's named after a temperature when, the temperature in my house was like, probably 115 degrees or some shit like that.
Yeah, I mean, in my case, my parents read me The Illustrated Man when I was a real little kid. And just the idea of the main character who he says, he decided he'd been injured in some sort of accident, I think. And he said he decided to get tattooed, and this witch from the future tattooed him. And boy, that just creeped me out so much. And, these different tattoos come to life. And in particular, one of the stories in the book is, I think it's called The Man. The way I remember it anyway is that the implication is that Jesus was a guy who sort of travels from planet to planet. And so he's arrived on this alien planet and kind of spread this message of peace and love and stuff. And one of the people on the planet says, his eyes were the color of the sky, the color of the sea, something like that. And I can just, still 30 years later, I can still hear my mom's voice saying those words. That passage struck me so much. And it's kind of like Raj was saying, and actually when we interviewed Carrie Vaughn back in episode 9, I remember she said that her epiphany about what language could do was reading a Ray Bradbury story, and that there was something about the smell of sneakers and and that she could smell, actually as she was reading the story, she could smell sneakers in her nose, and it was like, wow, that's really amazing. How can words just evoke that kind of sensation? But it's interesting, John, what you were saying about how you had this resistance to reading Ray Bradbury because he was assigned in school. And I think I had something of the same thing. I mean, I have read a fair bit of Bradbury, but I think I did have a resistance to reading him because he was sort of on this approved reading list. Actually, I think, speaking of our guest, Ursula K Le Guin, I think I probably would have read more of her work if, A Wizard of Earthsea hadn't been on the reading list in school. But I did have, because so many of my teachers were so hostile to fantasy and science fiction, they're like, oh, all that stuff is crap, except for these guys, they're good. There's like, you can't imagine a way to make a kid like me more hostile to those authors to do that,
I have a shameful confession to make, and that's that I missed that period, I guess, of reading Fahrenheit 451 in school, or maybe my school just decided to be different. I read The Illustrated Man, I think, when I was in 7th or 8th grade, but I never read Fahrenheit 451 in school, and I never read it until after he died. I loved his short fiction for many years, but it was always the short stories for me because, there are very few people who can write, for me at least, perfect short stories, and he was one of them. So I always reveled in the stories themselves. He died, and I was like, God, I never read Fahrenheit 451. I have to read it. And I read it, and I read it in 2 days, but I was blown away. It is it's a classic for a reason, obviously, but it's weird to me that it took me this long to get to it.
I saw actually that what he has on his tombstone, it says Ray Bradbury, author of Fahrenheit 451. That's his epitaph.
Oh, wow.
But even that it's a pretty short novel, isn't it? It's about 50,000 words or so.
Yeah.
And it's an expansion of a short story, isn't it?
Yeah. It was originally published as a novella called The Fireman, which is hard to find at this point. Although Subterranean Press recently released a collection that includes it. It's called Pleasure to Burn, which is a reference to the first line of the novel. It's the original novella plus some other stories that sort of influenced or else sort of tie into Fahrenheit 451, like sort of in Bradbury's mind, I guess, sort of stories that he sort of explored, some of the concepts that he later expanded on in Fahrenheit 451 to some degree or another. So like, the pedestrians in there, which I also reprinted in Brave New Worlds. But the primary feature of that book is The Fireman, which has been sort of unavailable for many years.
Well, it seems like often when an author takes a short story and expands it into a novel, everyone says, oh, the short story was better. That it really only needed to be a short story and they only expanded it into something longer for commercial reasons.
Right.
Was that the case with Fahrenheit 451, do you think, or does it?
I don't think so. I think that it legit works, beautifully as a novel. And, but I mean, it's hard to say because, I did encounter it first that way. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I've certainly encountered that myself. Like, I mean, my favorite story is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, and that was expanded into a novel, and it's fine. It's just, it doesn't need to be a novel because everything, all the good stuff is in the story.
Was Fahrenheit 451 published in Playboy originally? I seem to remember reading that.
Well, The Fireman was.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't think Fahrenheit 451 was serialized or anything, but The Fireman, the original novella, was published in Playboy.
And was it too controversial at the time to be published anywhere else?
I don't know about that. That's a good question. There's a good chance that it was published in Playboy strictly because, they paid a ton of money for these things, and it was a very prestigious place to publish something. On the other hand, they did also publish controversial stuff. So, it's a good question.
Okay, so Raj, I mean, John and I, as we've mentioned, both read this book as teenagers. Do you think that your experience reading it as an adult after so many years is different?
I think what surprised me the most was that while, the technology might not be as relevant to what we have right now, most of the themes were extremely relevant to our society today. I think a lot of the book itself is about a culture it's not just about the book burning, it's a culture of apathy that is developed in this future. And, it was almost chilling noticing certain familiar bits that were coming out in this novel that was written so long ago. I don't fear right now that we're going to lose books necessarily, maybe in the way that Bradbury did when he was writing this. But there's something in there about the simplification of the world. You know, everything gets boiled down into something that's easily digestible. And I think we see elements of that, you know, whether it's the 2-minute soundbite that we have on the news, or, you know, the way that movies often these days seem to be very simplified. I guess because they teach it to kids, or teenagers, I suppose, I was expecting just a more straightforward narrative, but, you know, his language is still there, and, you know, the images that he uses and his metaphors, which are just amazing.
Well, you know, John mentioned the short story, The Pedestrian, which I guess was also sort of a thematic or spiritual precursor to Fahrenheit 451. And the way I remember that story anyway is there's a guy and he's just out walking at night and gets picked up by the police, and walking around at night has just become a crime, and no one's even sort of really aware of that because they're just all hypnotized by their television sets. I just read that one within the past couple of years, and that really struck home to me because I do walk around a lot at night, and you do sort of get hassled a lot. And I feel like that's something Bradbury captures in that and in Fahrenheit 451 really well, this idea of that there's this persecution of people who are different, even if they're different in a completely innocuous way.
Yeah, I mean, definitely with what's her name, Clarice in the beginning. That Guy meets Clarice, who's, you know, she likes to take walks and think about the world and look at things, and everyone, you know, throughout the rest of the book basically puts her down, and even after she dies, like, who cares about her? She was a weirdo.
I was talking about this at dinner with my family, and you know, I have a stepdaughter who's 18, and you know, so she just recently finished high school, and you know, she didn't have to read Fahrenheit 451 in high school, and I was sort of appalled, you know, although on the one hand I was appalled that they're not teaching it in her class, on the other hand it's like, well, you know, it didn't work for me. I don't know how much it works for other teenagers. It's like, maybe it's better to come to them on your own. But she said instead of Fahrenheit 451, they actually read. She said they read some short story instead, and she started describing it. She's like, well, it's about this guy who's sort of walking around the neighborhood. And I was like, oh, The Pedestrian by Ray Bradbury. And she's like, oh, yeah. And so it was just kind of funny. It's like, you know, it's like from, you know, when they picked a dystopian story and she describes like, you know, like the first little tiny bit of the story, it's like, oh, well, yeah, that's obviously that, right? I mean, I was glad that they were still teaching Ray Bradbury, even if they weren't teaching Fahrenheit 451. And actually, I mean, it kind of made me think that really short stories, maybe, I mean, this is kind of a tangent, but I mean, it's like, I kind of feel like short stories is probably a better thing to try to teach kids in high school, like, and stuff. It's just because it's like, you know, to sustain their interest in a novel over the course of reading a whole novel, it just seems like it's asking a bit too much, especially when you have so much to cover in a curriculum. But yeah, I mean, you know, certainly, like, and I mean, you know, Brave New Worlds has actually been used in several classrooms, and there was some, I had some interest in from teachers of high school students asking, you know, who had emailed me to ask, you know, is there anything in there that like a high school would it be inappropriate for a high school student, you know, because they wanted to use it in the classroom, and I mean, I think that kind of thing is cool, because I think dystopian fiction in particular is something that's really relevant to young people, you know, at that age.
The one thing when I read for Fahrenheit 451, one thing I really remember is that there was this afterword by Ray Bradbury. And one thing he mentioned is that the main characters, Montag and Faber, if I'm remembering right, are both named after, it was like a pencil company and a paper company or something like that. And he said he didn't even realize that when he wrote it. It was purely subconscious.
Oh, that's funny.
But also, he also included an extra chapter in this edition. I don't know if that's in every edition, but it was as an appendix. And it's a chapter in which the main character is shown into his boss's secret library. And the guy explains that, you know, that his job is to burn books, but that his passion is actually to collect books. And he has the secret library of books. And Bradbury said that he just loved this chapter so much, but he couldn't find a way to fit it into the plot anywhere. And, but he liked it too much to just completely discard it. So he had included it as an appendix. But I've always found that chapter one of the most memorable parts of the book, because it does express this truth that moralizing crusaders often are the ones who are the most enraptured of the thing that they claim to despise.
Yeah, my copy didn't have that extra chapter, but I mean, I think that fits in with my understanding, at least, or my thoughts about the chief, and I forget his name right now, but yeah, I mean, he was the one who was able to quote like every book ever in Fahrenheit 451. So I feel lucky that I got to read The Illustrated Man in school, because, you know, it was like, I got excited because I was already into science fiction at the time. And I was like, we get to read this for class. And then because we got to read several different stories, it was almost like this treasure chest of cool ideas. I remember a few from that very specifically, like The Man, like Dave mentioned. And there's a story, and I can't remember, I almost want to say it's like The Return, where these white astronauts land on a planet that's pretty much all black, because they were forced to leave Earth, and they colonized their own place. And the white astronauts, you know, Earth, I think, was destroyed by that time, and they had to land. And it was, you know, this moment of, do we treat them the way that they treated us, or do we treat them differently? And I thought that was really, for me, that was like one of the key stories we read in school, because, you know, it does tackle race relations, which don't always see a lot in stories like that. But then the other story from that collection that I remember very clearly is one where it's just this guy who's in a spacesuit falling through space, and he knows that he's going to burn up in the atmosphere. And, you know, I think even a comet or something shoots by and like takes off his arm, and his suit seals around it. And so it's just this like fatalistic story about this guy and what he thinks about when he's basically floating through space. And it's amazing. And yet in the end, what I find amazing, because I think of Bradbury as this amazing optimist. And in the end, you know, this guy burns up on the way through the atmosphere, but a little kid looks up and sees it, and, you know, wishes on the shooting star. And I think it becomes an inspiration for him. So, and just the end of Fahrenheit 451, there's that hopeful note of these guys, you know, wandering about, storing this information in their heads and kind of holding it for a time when they can write it down again. So.
Another story from that book I really remember is this one where there are these guys on Venus. This is, you know, pulp era kind of Venus, and in this story on Venus, it never stops raining, like literally never stops raining, and so you have to get to these sort of heated domes, I guess I would say, and if you spend too long out in the rain, you just go crazy, and people will just sort of fall to their knees and stare up at the sky and open their mouths and drown themselves just because they've just gone insane because of the nonstop rain.
So, Dave, I have a correction. You're actually right that Fahrenheit 451 was serialized in Playboy. I was wrong. The fireman appeared in Galaxy.
Any other stories from Illustrated Man that particularly stick in you guys' minds?
I get confused as to which stories appeared where, because I feel like I have so many different collections by him that things jump places. Because I think the copy of The Illustrated Man that I read didn't actually have The Illustrated Man in it. It was just a framing sequence.
Wait, I thought it just was a framing sequence.
You know, there is a story called The Illustrated Man as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was the one that I remember listening to when I was a kid. And that's the other thing, too. Those stories I listened to on that audio tape, all of which are pretty much burned into my brain, are from various places. So some of them were even from Martian Chronicles, which I didn't find out until much later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, some of the stories in The Illustrated Man are also in the Martian Chronicles. They're not mutually exclusive. Yeah, I mean, I think, from The Illustrated Man, I mean, there's certainly the Welt is something, worthy of discussing. I know that's one of your favorites, Dave.
Yeah, or at least it's one that made a big impression on me because I encountered it so young. I actually saw a really good adaptation of that. It was like a Twilight Zone episode or something. Just the way it's the stories about these kids who have a sort of VR, virtual reality playroom. And they're just obsessed with recreating the African veldt, and that becomes more and more real, and their parents become more and more concerned. Yeah, just the way he described just the creepy, just it was so creepy, the animals and the flies buzzing and the heat and stuff like that.
Yeah, that one creeped me out when I was a kid too, especially because they're these kids who become obsessed with this, and in the end, their parents basically get killed, right, by the lions that are in this belt that they create. But it's never explicit. It's just, like you see, I think the vultures circling over bodies or whatever when the psychologist comes to visit.
Well, and I think a lot of people think of Bradbury as being a sort of good-natured writer for children, but so many of his stories are so disturbing. I've never read this story, but I've heard that maybe his first story, or one of his early stories anyway, is sort of this kind of psychological horror story about a guy who can't stop thinking about the fact that there's a skeleton inside his body. It's like this horror monster basically. It's like living inside his body. And, God, just to come up with an idea like that, it's, that's really cool.
But, one of my favorite stories of his is this story called Pillar of Fire. I mean, it's actually one of the harder ones to find, although it's in that collection I mentioned, A Pleasure to Burn. It's basically, it's like set in the future, and this guy who was like the last murderer in the world or whatever, he wakes up from his grave, and he pulls himself out of his grave, and he finds himself in this world where crime has been abolished and nobody has any, understanding of what a criminal act would be or what evil is. And so he like wakes up just hating. And that's like the first line makes some reference to that. And it's just like, he's just full of hatred. And so he finds himself in this, utterly naive world and goes on a killing spree.
Dave, to answer your earlier question about other stories from the Illustrated Man, the other one that sticks out in my head is Marionettes Incorporated, which is kind of an interesting story because, it's about artificial humans. And the idea is that this guy wants to buy one of these clockwork creations to replace himself, to basically take his place with his wife. The funny thing about that story is like they can actually, if you put your ear close to the marionette, you can actually hear like tick-tocking inside. So even though it's this futuristic story, there's this kind of clockwork element to it.
I think people would often talk about the ABCs of science fiction, the Asimov, Bradbury, and Clarke. And Bradbury was always, I think, different in that he was, like, I think there's a quote from him where he says something like, I don't try to predict the future, I try to prevent it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that quote and sort of coupled with his stance in his later years, vehement stance against the internet. Like he hated the internet. He wouldn't allow his books to be published as ebooks for many years. Finally, Fahrenheit 451 recently came out as an ebook, but prior to that, like none of his work was available in electronic format. And so there's this real sense of him being an enemy to technology and, being one of our greatest, living writers of any genre, certainly, but, as somebody that we claim as a science fiction fantasy writer, it's a little troubling that like writers like him and like writers like Michael Crichton, who obviously is in a different sort of category, is not, not the pro stylist Ray Bradbury is, but still very popular, but also someone who writes stuff that's very anti-science or anti-technology, or, in the sense that those elements, the scientific or technological elements are often the antagonist in the stories. It's a little bothersome to me that those writers are very popular versus writers who champion technology and science and stuff are not nearly so.
Actually, speaking of the Fahrenheit 451 ebook, I saw that when he finally relented and let it be released, it was conditional on the fact that anyone in any library could download it for free.
That's awesome. I didn't know that.
He loved libraries. I mean, he basically said he couldn't afford to go to school, so he learned everything by just going to the library, and that stuck with him, that love and want. I think that's part of the idea also behind Fahrenheit 451. Wanting to protect these kind of places where people can go and read and learn and the other thing is I agree with you, John, in his idea of, or his attitudes towards technology. I try to look at the other side, which is, his desire that for people to basically live life to the fullest, which sounds like a cliche, but, also to go out and see things and touch things and experience being in the world rather than, I guess, shutting yourself away from it, which, again, is in Fahrenheit 451 with the wife who basically, sits in between the three screens all the time, wanting the fourth screen and only interacts with this kind of fake online world. what I like to interpret his stance on is to kind of have that balance, but not necessarily to demonize all technology. So
yeah, and I mean, he might be right about some things. I mean,
Sure.
I think it's important that we don't let our boosterism of science and technology turn into naive techno-optimism. And I mean, for example, Bradbury was notoriously hostile to automobiles. And as a kid, I just thought that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard. But the older I get, and especially after having lived in Los Angeles, the more merit I see to that view. And you just think like 30,000 a year, 30,000 people a year in this country die in automobile accidents. And is this really the best way to be getting people from one place to another? This mass carnage. It's funny that actually I think it was a Larry Niven story where it's set in the future, and in this future, there's mass transit and the cars are all driven by AIs and stuff like that. And people like the daredevil type people will just drive cars like we do, without any AI, and they have to go to these special areas and they just, drive their cars using steering wheels, and people in the wider society just consider them suicidal, basically. And I think there's actually some merit to that view. I think maybe Bradbury was onto something on that in that case.
My favorite short story of his is "There Will Come Soft Rains," which is this great, it's it's one of the saddest stories I've ever read. I mean, it's just like there's like so much feeling in that story, which is funny because there's no people in it. It's a post-apocalyptic setting where like all the people have died, and it's about this smart house, which just keeps continuing to do its duty, even in the absence of people. Making the toast and doing all its various, morning rituals that it did to prepare for its people waking up and all that. And it's just such a beautiful story. Just, to the language and the emotion that he packs in. I mean, it's a really short story too. It's like 2,000 words, And I'll never forget this too. Like I saw this, stage adaptation of it, at the New York City, Fringe Festival. And oh my God, it was so beautiful. And just like, I wish that was like recorded, that I could like just show it to everyone like on YouTube or something. Cause it's like, I get that, like, that part of the point of a play is so that, you go see the play and that's how you experience it. But it's just like, it seems like a shame that like, I can't just make everybody watch this cause it was so amazing. I mean, I was in tears by the end of it. So were you there for that, Dave?
I was, yeah. And it was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And I was thinking of that actually when Ursula Le Guin in the interview was saying about how she seems to do so much better with stage adaptations of her work than film and TV adaptations. Because boy, that stage adaptation of There Will Come Soft Rains was fantastic. And there's a part in the story where a dog comes back to this automated house and sort of comes in through the dog door, but then the house won't let it out again, and it's sort of running around. And I think it starves to death, even though because the house keeps preparing meals and putting them on the table and clearing them off, but the dog can't get to any of those meals, and it just sort of eventually lies down and dies. And they had this sort of dog puppet that was running around. And the way it was done is that they actually read the entire text of the short story. So you were sort of seeing it acted out on stage and you're hearing the words, and there were different colored lights and stuff. And yeah, the whole thing was just amazing.
Yeah, that is my favorite short story as well of his. And I'm actually sad I didn't see the stage play because I do remember when it was being mentioned, but I guess I never made it out. But it is really haunting. And it was another one of those that I listened to as a kid. And I remember, just feeling this loneliness like infused throughout this story. And, I remember there's a part where he describes the silhouettes of people burnt against, I guess, the house or the wall or something like that. Mm-hmm. And, as a kid, I remember thinking like, oh, I understand what this is, like this is after a nuclear attack or something. It's amazing that he can get that kind of emotion, like you said, out of a story with no people where everything's mechanical. And it's just this house kind of going through the motions. And yet the house, you almost feel sorry for the house because there's no people for it to take care of.
Now, is that story part of the Martian Chronicles?
Yes. Which is weird to me because, again, that was the one I discovered later on. I'm like, how does this fit into the Martian Chronicles? But
Well, that's actually that's one of my problems with the Martian Chronicles. Like, I don't feel like it really holds together all that well as a collection. Like, the individual stories are great, but having them together like as this one thing where it's like all the Martian Chronicles, like, I don't know, like you say, like, that story doesn't really seem like it fits to me. Like, it doesn't belong there.
I don't know if this is exactly true, but from reading about it, they were basically, saying like, why don't you write a novel? And he was like, I don't know if I can do that. And they were like, why don't we just shove these together and kind of slap a theme on top of it? But I mean, I guess that's the thing. I've always read them as separate stories and not kind of interrelated. And obviously they take stories out and pop them into other collections here and there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's what happened with the Illustrated Man too, is that, he came up with this frame story to have a sort of an excuse to have it not just be a story collection. It's like, oh, well, no, it's got this whole interwoven narrative, and it's like, and some of those are kind of questionable too. It's like, you're really? Oh, okay, all right, fine. But, it's like, it works better in the Illustrated Man than I think in the Martian Chronicles as far as that goes. Personally, like, I'd rather it just be a collection without that sort of framing stuff, although, like, the Illustrated Man is really great. But, I don't know what the publishing climate was like at the time. Maybe it's just that, that's not something that you could really get away with. And I mean, even now, certainly, I mean, if you have a novel, that's going to sell a lot better than a short story collection. So, it is probably a commercial decision. And in the case of Illustrated Man, it worked out really well. With the case of Martian Chronicles, I don't know. I'm not as big a fan, although I'm certainly in the minority of that.
The story I remember from Martian Chronicles most vividly is the one where these settlers land on Mars and finds that it's just like their hometown from their childhood, and all their parents and siblings are all there young the way that they used to be, and they're just so happy to have found this place, and they sort of go to bed smiling about how happy they are to be there. And then the whole town sort of rises up and murders them in their sleep because they're all just Martians, in disguise. I think it would actually be really interesting to go back and read Martian Chronicles now, having read the John Carter books, because Martian Chronicles was sort of playing off this whole decades-long history of Mars in science fiction that I was completely unaware of when I read it as a teenager. I saw a quote one time where somebody said that one of Ray Bradbury's great accomplishments was putting a hot dog stand on Mars. Yeah, who else would have thought to do that? So,
There Will Come Soft Rain is just such an amazing title. And I mean, his stories are amazing, but some of them are just like The Man, The Ravine, The Foghorn. And I think that came out of the way that he used to get ideas to write. I haven't read too much about this, but basically he said what he would do is sometimes to, come up with an idea for a short story, just write down some nouns. He would start listing nouns. And then after he had some nouns, he would start thinking about those and get some basic ideas or maybe even sensory impressions of these specific nouns. And then that would basically snowball into the idea of the story. And he basically, I believe he used to write, or at least used to teach to write short stories basically all in one sitting, not final draft, but basically to get your first draft out right away, because that's when those ideas are kind of fresh and they'll change, or you'll lose that momentum if you don't do that. Which I've tried to do, and it's really hard. I mean, I think so. So my theory was always that, when he writes The Ravine, and that's the title, it's because, he thought ravine, interesting word, and like started thinking about things to do with ravine, and that started a whole story. So.
Well, I kind of like titles sometimes where it's just the such and such, because when you've read 100 stories by somebody and you're looking for one particular one, it can be easier to find it if it's called The Ravine than if it's called, some really poetic, evocative thing that doesn't necessarily relate that much to the, I mean, There Will Come Soft Rains, it does actually relate to the story, but in a lot of cases, stories with fantastic titles, they don't actually help you identify the story particularly.
Yeah. I should mention also that There Will Come Soft Rains is actually a line, I believe, from a poem. So it's not like he came up with it, but I think it's still a fitting title. I mean, a lot of us do that too. We steal lines from something else to title stories.
Certainly people have stolen plenty from Bradbury.
Yeah.
I've heard that he had like filing cabinets full of hundreds or thousands of unused story ideas. So I sort of wonder what what the disposition of all those thousands of story ideas will be now. Will they be put into the public domain, or I don't even know.
They probably won't be posted on the internet.
That'd be great though if they just sent some of these ideas out to writers and said, okay, do something with this, and then collected all of those into some kind of collection or something.
There's that joke that, and, writers always hate, like, well, where do you get your ideas? And the old joke is like, oh, I send a letter or self-addressed stamped envelope to this post office box in Schenectady or whatever, and it's like, it's like, well, they could actually set that up, and it'd be like the Bradbury, idea fund, and, and just actually send an idea,
There was actually, I saw it was a small press book, but it was, I guess, Lovecraft. The same thing happened when he died. He had this list of 1,000 story ideas he had never gotten around to using. And so for this anthology, they you participated in the anthology and they would randomly assign you one of the ideas from this list. And that made up the contents of the anthology. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Actually, for what it's worth, we should mention that there's this new anthology called Shadow Show, which is, edited by Sam Weller and Mort Castle. The subtitle is All New Stories in Celebration of Ray Bradbury. So they're all stories that are sort of influenced or inspired by Bradbury in some way, not actually set in the same world as any of his stories or anything, but sort of inspired by his work. It's got an all-star lineup like Neil Gaiman, Margaret Atwood, Harlan Ellison, Joe Hill, Kelly Link. All sorts of major writers are in there. And that just came out, actually just coincidentally, right around the time that he died. It was in progress to come out as a tribute anthology while he was still here. But then just unfortunately, he happened to die right before it came out. So, and Neil Gaiman's story you can actually find online, because when Bradbury died, they decided to go ahead and make that available because it's a very moving tribute to the man.
Yeah, and if you don't know who Sam Weller is, he befriended Bradbury and lived in his basement. I guess Bradbury gave Sam access to his files and everything, and so Sam produced the definitive Ray Bradbury biography.
My wife actually met him at the Santa Barbara Writers Conference, where he was the guest speaker for many years. He would basically kick off the convention by giving a little lecture. So, he devoted a lot of time to trying to help, the next generation and new generations that followed in his footsteps. So.
Yeah, I saw him in person once. He came and, he did an appearance at, I think, Roman's bookstore in Pasadena when I was living in LA. And, unfortunately, there were about 500 people ahead of me. And there was a line of about 500 people, waiting to get books signed and things. And I couldn't stay that long. But, that was the one I did. I did sort of linger by the desk and just sort of watch him interact with some of the people. And, that was as close as I got. Are there any other Ray Bradbury works that you guys want to talk about? I guess one that I wanted to talk about was his novel, Something Wicked This Way Comes. Actually, speaking of stealing titles from people. But it's about these two boys in the kind of a Midwest American town when this sinister carnival comes to town one summer. And it has just a fantastic sort of opening prologue, which unfortunately I probably can't repeat word for word, but it ends, it says something like, they would never be so young again. And I believe that this was expanded from a short story called Black Ferris. And I don't know, have either of you guys read that one?
I haven't. And that was one of the ones I think as a kid, it sounded interesting, but for some reason I never got into it. Is it scary? Is it horror?
Yeah, I would say so. The part I really remember from that is that there's this witch who flies around town in this miniature Zeppelin, is the way I remember it anyway. And, so the main character kind of sees this Zeppelin kind of skimming across the trees toward his house, and he climbs out his window and runs away. And there is this definite air of menace. See, Raj, you wrote this article, right? Ray Bradbury, Mr. Electro and Me. Could you talk maybe about who's Mr. Electro and?
Yeah, it's actually Mr. Electrico, but I learned about this because before he even died, I had been pointed in the direction of the Paris Review website, which has a bunch of interviews that they've done over the years with various authors. And Bradbury's is one of the best that they have up there. And of course, I immediately focused on him because of his science fictional background. But he talks about how when he was a kid, like this character existed, and he went to this carnival, and Mr. Electrico actually, would have electricity pass through his body. And he had this little, like, I think a sword, I think it was, that he would touch people in the audience with, and then their hair would start to like stick up because the electrical current would pass through it. I think the key moment that a lot of people talk about is when he reached out to Bradbury and touched him with the sword and said, "Live forever." And, his response was, I decided to do that. It was kind of this interesting contrast because he died obviously last month, but, obviously through his fiction, I would be surprised if he did not live forever that way. But the other interesting thing is that he hung around with Mr. Electrico at the carnival, and he got introduced to all the members of the carny folk who were working there. And apparently Mr. Electrico felt that he was a reincarnation. Bradbury was a reincarnation of a lost friend of his. And so, they felt this immediate connection to one another. And that apparently formed the basis for, obviously, Something Wicked This Way Comes, and maybe some other stuff. Like, I don't know if The Illustrated Man came out of that experience as well. But I just thought it was this, magical idea of this young Bradbury kind of going to this carnival and just almost like being adopted for the day by all these people who work there, and having this connection immediately with this one guy. And especially as I was writing it, because I wanted to write it as a tribute, because he was one of these heroes of mine, and he's one of these people who, changed my life when it comes to the way I look at fiction and the way I look at words and writing. So for me, at least, it was this interesting parallel where this guy, who touched him physically, sent this energy into him and changed his life, because he said after that, he decided to start writing and make sure he wrote 1,000 words every day. And I wasn't physically touched by Ray Bradbury, but listening to those tapes when I was a kid, it was him reading his stories. And so it was, a different kind of contact, but that kind of awakened something in me, awakened some appreciation of language, interest in writing, and carrying through to this day. And I thought, that was really amazing. So.
See, and John, you also just wrote an article about Ray Bradbury called Sci-Fi Scribes on Ray Bradbury, Storyteller, Showman, and Alchemist, in which you sort of collected testimonials kind of from different writers about Ray Bradbury. Do any of those sort of stick out in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, so I did that article for Wired.com. It was of the people who responded. I think like Greg Bear's response sort of sticks out. I mean, he's very heartfelt, and he talks about as I was mentioning earlier, how Bradbury would sort of take people aside and as a young writer, spend time talking to them. And Joe Hill has a quote. Daniel H. Wilson, Jonathan Mayberry. So a lot of people on there. Say very, very nice things about Bradbury, and it's really a nice tribute to the man.
So you mentioned to me that Christie was really affected by Ray Bradbury. Is that, I don't know if that's too personal to talk about, but is that anything you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mentioned how my wife had met Bradbury at the Santa Barbara Risers Conference. So, and a lot of ways, he was like her literary hero, and then, and so she took his death really hard, and she sort of, found herself crying a lot after his death, and she would go to bed and take a collection with her and try to read some of his stories, but then it's like I had to take it away from her. It's like, no, you can't do that anymore, because it was upsetting her too much, and then she couldn't go to sleep, and she had to work the next day and everything, and so. He's that kind of writer that just really touched people in such a profound way that his loss was like palpable.
Raj, you want to tell us maybe? I mean, you mentioned that you're a writer yourself and have been kind of influenced by Bradbury. You want to tell people like what you've written and maybe what they should go check out?
Sure. I've published only short stories so far. I have a novel in the works, but my fiction, it's appeared in various places. one of John's anthologies, The Way of the Wizard. I have a story this year, earlier this year, on Beneath Ceaseless Skies. And I have a few more that are coming out. The next one that I have coming out is in an anthology, a YA dystopian anthology called Diverse Energies, that was edited by Joe Monti and Tobias Bakel. It's coming out from 2 books in October, I believe. So that's my next story. It's called What Arms to Hold. But yeah, my website is www.rajankhanna.com. So I should probably spell that. It's RAJANKHANNA.com, and all my stories are listed there.
And as you can tell from his dulcet tones, he's got quite a nice voice on him, and he's done a bunch of narrations for podcasts like Starship Sofa and Podcastle and the like. And including he's done a couple for me. He narrated Joe Lansdale's story from my Barsoom anthology, which ran here on Wired. And what was the other one you just did recently?
I don't know, but I narrated one of David's stories, actually. The Cats in Victory, wasn't it? Yeah.
Do any of those stories you mentioned, Raj, have a pronounced Ray Bradbury influence?
It's interesting because I think I've just recently rededicated myself to not necessarily, copying from him, but kind of taking some of the spirit of what he does. And I guess what I've taken from it is more of a, dedication or to try to honor my love for the language and his love for the language, because, I think he kind of kicked off that for me. I guess just in reading what he's been writing, also just his attitude, his kind of unbridled enthusiasm, not just for life and writing, but, just for everything, it seemed like, and he wrote such not horrific, but scary stories, I suppose. Sometimes, cautionary tales, sometimes really creepy, but it seemed like, as a person, he was just kind of full of joy for life and, trying to have that more in my life, I suppose, as well.
All right, cool. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So Raj, thanks for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me.
And thanks again to Ursula K Le Guin for being our guest today. If you enjoyed today's show, please head on over to the iTunes store and give us a review or rating there. All right, so that was our show. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.